Hey guys, downtown Josh Brown. I'm here with my very special guest, Morgan Housel. If you're an investor or a trader or even sentient, you've probably at some point been sent a link to something Morgan has written. I think he's one of the best financial writers of our generation. So happy to have him on to talk about his new book, The Psychology of Money, which you're 100% going to read. And Morgan and I are going to talk about what went into the making of it and how it came out the way it did, and I think you'll really have a lot of fun with this. So stick around. Okay, so welcome to the show, published author Morgan Housel. Look at you.
Thanks for having me, Josh. I know.
Look at you go. So
It was, I've been a blogger for 13 years, and everyone thinks it's a much bigger deal if you take your words and put them between cardboard. For some reason, that means
it's a
something
bigger
to people.
deal because it means that a publishing house deemed your words worthy enough to invest actual money in the physical economy. The digital is free. You could write 9 books a
Maybe.
day. It costs nobody anything. So
Yeah, I guess that's true. But this is true for you. I mean, you've been a blogger for longer than I have, and you've written 2 books. Did it feel that different when you wrote about? I mean, it's the same content,
yes.
right?
Here's why it feels different. 3 things. The first thing is I work in the investment management industry. And so the bulk of my clients are people over 50. And yeah, they've seen the Kindle. Ooh, they still like holding a physical book. By the way, this is one of the most old-fashioned things about me. If I have the choice, I would rather hold a book than read something on a screen. I mean, I
Yeah.
read on the beach. I don't want to sit there with electronics. So that's why, number one, it's a big deal because for a very large amount of the book reading public, especially investors, they respect books. They respect books. So that's one. And then two, when the media talks to you, they now look at you differently. You're not like a guy on WordPress. You are a published author.
You're right about that. I just think it's an interesting quirk. I've always joked too that like if you take a blog post and convert it to PDF, people will take it more seriously. They'll be like, "Oh, this is a white paper." Like there's something about the format that makes people take it more seriously. And a book is the ultimate example of that.
Umberto Eco, I think this might have been in Foucault's Pendulum. I'm not sure which book, but the plot was that there's a couple of guys running what used to be called a vanity press. You know what a vanity press is? Have you heard that term?
No,
So they're in
no.
they're in Rome or maybe Florence, and people that want to have written a book come to them and pay them like $50,000 or $25,000, and they will make someone's vanity book for them, and they might even write it
Okay.
for them. Because the book is like the stepping stone to a lot of other things. And I think this book's from the 80s. So it's probably even bigger deal then because there was no internet.
You could call it the art of the deal or something.
Yeah. And then I
Vanity
know
book.
like many authors, I'm not going to use anyone's names, but I know many authors who bought out the whole first printing of the book that they had ghostwritten. Tell me that's not the most Wall Street fing mentality you've ever heard. It's like, okay, here's my autobiography. I dictated it to some guy sitting by the pool over Christmas vacation in Miami. And now the book's coming out, and I'm going to buy up every single copy so it's sold out, and I can make the New York Times bestseller list. Like, I literally know 3 people who have done that. And I actually read one of these books like an idiot without realizing that it was ghostwritten. And I immediately
It's
regretted
awful.
hours of my time that I gave to nothing. So that's the thing. All right, but you're not doing that. I think I've said this before, you and Ben Carlson are probably the 2 best financial writers of your generation. And I think what you do really well in this book is the chapters are short and sweet. There are many
Yeah.
chapters. The book is like 200 pages ish, right? 210 pages?
It's 255. When I set
255.
out to
Okay.
start writing it, it was like, look, I'm a big reader, and I know you're a big reader, but how many books do I actually finish? How many books do I read to the last page? For me, it's maybe like 1 in 7, 1 in 10, maybe something like that. I probably go through periods where I haven't finished like any of the last 20 books that I've read. And to me, what I really wanted to do with this book is the statistic I want to maximize for, and you can't track this, so I'm never going to know, but is how many people actually read to the end. And for me, it was, look, most topics do not require 250 pages of explanation to get your point across. Like the whole Declaration of Independence is like 4,000 words. So don't tell me that you need, 90,000 words to explain interest rate cycles or something.
Hold on.
You just know most books are too much fluff.
Will you force yourself to finish a book if you feel like you're supposed to because of either who the author is or the subject matter? So you don't feel
Absolutely
guilty?
Not. And there are a lot of books that I recommend to people and I love. I think they're great books. And when I would speak honestly and say that was such a good book that I didn't finish because I got the point. The point was very good. I learned something from the point, but then most books are just another 300 pages of supporting evidence. And I'm like, okay, I get it. I get it. So what I wanted to do for this book was rather than making one point and rambling about it for 250 pages, I wanted to make 20 points. I wanted to get my point across really quickly. And I want people to be able to finish that because I hope, I don't want to, jinx it, but I hope there's not a lot of excessive rambling in this. I hope it's like, here's my point. I want to make that point in a coherent way and then move on. I'm going to move on to the next
You're
point.
not rambling. You're writing with what they said, the expression is you're writing with economy. Like you're getting big points across with a couple of paragraphs and then you're moving. Like it keeps moving. So I really appreciate that.
Just keep it going. Yeah. So the book is 19 chapters. Each chapter is about 2,500 words, which if you're not familiar, a normal length blog post is probably 1,000 words. Okay. So this is 2,500 word chapters that are in the book.
Okay.
19 chapters.
So a lot of the things I've found this to be, I don't like the word quirk, maybe let's say an idiosyncrasy of your writing style. You're really good at matching an easy story to tell that everyone can relate to with a financial premise or a financial concept. But I find that a lot of the examples you choose have to do with the fact that a lot of things happen where the circumstances can never be repeated. So like just to reference in chapter 2 of your book, you tell this story that is like nobody knows this story, but everybody should understand it about Bill Gates being one of the only high school students in the world with access to a computer in a classroom in 1968 when he's 13 years old. That confluence of things. So he's obviously a genius, obviously brilliant, but he's in this specific school, Lakeside School outside in the suburbs of Seattle, and it's the only school that has this particular machine, and he can use it whenever he feels like it. So him and his friend Paul Allen have endless time to play around on it. And he's at the perfect age, this formative age of 13. Like it's a 1 in a million chance that out of the 300 million people that are like a teenager, a high school student in that time, he just happens to be one of them. So I just think it's like you do a really good job at explaining, yes, this seems like it was meant to be, but it was completely random. Can you talk a little bit about why that concept is so important to everyone?
It's really important because look, that chapter is about luck and risk. And luck and risk, I've always said, are like the opposite sides of the exact same coin. Both luck and risk are this idea that there are things in life that happen outside of our control that have a bigger impact on outcomes than anything we did intentionally.
Okay.
And people understand that in investing. They understand risk. Everyone talks about risk. You adjust your returns for risk. You hire risk managers, talk about risk all day long. But in investing, we rarely talk about luck. Or because if you're talking about someone else's luck, you look like a jerk. Oh, that guy was successful, but he just got lucky. Or if you talking about your own luck, that can be hard to look yourself in the mirror. Maybe someone has been successful, but they don't want to look in the mirror and say, well, I mean, have I just been lucky? That's a hard thing to swallow. So even though we know that luck is all over the world, we hardly ever talk about it. So Bill Gates, I make this point, Bill Gates is obviously a genius, one of the hardest working businessmen of our time. This is not to say that Bill Gates was just lucky, but when you realize that he went to the only high school in America with a computer, you realize there is a massive element of luck right here. Yeah. You cannot ignore that.
And he says
if someone says Bill Gates was lucky, they'd say, no, he's a genius. He worked 1 million hours a week. So it's hard to separate that both of those things can be true. And what it really means, this is really true in investing where we have a lot of idols, whether it's Warren Buffett or Elon Musk or Ken Griffin, whoever your investing idol is, Jim Simons, that we tend to look at that person and say, well, what did he or she do? And how can I emulate that? Because what are the daily habits that they had? What are the systems that they have? And I want to copy those habits so I can be just as successful. And if you don't realize how much of an element luck plays into success, particularly massive success, the bigger the success, the more the element of luck is likely to play at some point in there. I think so. I think it has to be. I don't think anyone can be wildly successful through 100%.
Time out. So then what do you, all right. So let me challenge you on that. And I'm not saying you're wrong, but I've heard it phrased differently where people say, how many times can somebody be successful in a row before you stop calling what they've done luck and just recognize that they are the superior player in their game?
That's very different because previous success creates momentum to future success.
Okay.
But the first success that got you there is like Bill Gates. It's not that, when Bill Gates was successful in 1980 and he was also successful in 1990 and he's also successful in the year 2000. So he, like you could say, there's continual success
it's
there.
Path dependent.
But the original thing that got him,
It's
it's all path dependent. But the original thing that got him there, in his own words, was the fact that the dumb luck that he went to Lakeside High School.
Okay. So
and so we just need to be more careful as investors about who we worship and taking the right lessons away from those people and saying, look, if I admire Warren Buffett, I'm not necessarily going to say, well, he eats at McDonald's every day and he does this and these are the books that he reads and these are the exact formulas that he uses. And then therefore, if I copy those, I'm going to be as successful as him. You can never make that connection because there's so much of an element of path-dependent luck that happens in everyone's successes and everyone's failures as well. It's easy to look at different failures and say, look at these idiots. They obviously made big mistakes. And of course, they probably did. But there's also this element of risk where the line between success and failure can be so thin and only known in hindsight. So I use the example in the book of Cornelius Vanderbilt, who's one of the most successful, richest businessmen of all time. And if you talk to people today, people will be like, oh, he was a great businessman. He was very successful. He was scrappy. His net worth adjusted for inflation was like $300 billion. But if you go back and read about the guy, he was at every step of the way flagrantly breaking the law, just running it over, tearing it up, spitting on it.
He was a pirate. They were all pirates.
He was a pirate.
Era. Yeah.
And so you can so easily imagine where the story of Cornelius Vanderbilt was not the most successful businessman of all time. It was this pirate who ended up in jail. Yeah. That easily could have been the story. And just because it went a slightly different way, just means we need to be careful at looking at him and saying, what did he do that I should do as well?
Yeah, so that's such an important point. And then I think just the era you live in and what opportunities exist for you in one decade that 2 decades later, somebody trying to emulate what you did and those opportunities are not there. And, in technology, the implications of that are obvious. In investing, they're less obvious, but they should be more obvious. And just this idea that, well, I practice a style of value investing that's been seasoned over 70 years. Congratulations. You have 70 years worth of information that's now being copied not only by your competitors, but by computer programs, flawlessly replicated. So best of luck with that. So I think that's one element that people, I think, don't appreciate enough. And then the other thing, which you get into, the backdrop of the times in which you live and invest are going to have such a huge impact on what your results are, regardless of how much effort you put into it. And this example you give of somebody being born in 1950, their teenage and 20s, right? So starting at age 13 through the age of 30, what the stock market returns is going to have a big impact on how they feel about it. So that person living in 1950 starts becoming aware of the stock market in 1963. Over the next 15, 17 years, the returns are zero.
It's a disaster.
Inflation adjusted, they make no money. It's a disaster with multiple crashes. But that same person born in 1970 sees the market rise tenfold in their teens and 20s. And, Nick Majuli wrote something about this where if you had outperformed the stock market by 5% a year in the 1960s and 70s, your returns would be worse than the person who underperformed the stock market in the 80s and 90s, because the tailwind of the time you live is going to be so much more important than whatever you think your own skill is for the most part. Why do you think we don't appreciate that factor as much as we should?
It's impossible, I think, to put yourself in someone else's shoes. So you and I can look back and say, and study people from the Great Depression, and we can read about it and read about what they went through and try to say, what would it be like for me to live like that? But unless you've actually been there, unless you actually did it, unless you actually lived in the Great Depression, unless you actually, served in World War II, whatever the big event is, you cannot put yourself in those shoes and replicate that kind of fear and uncertainty that people live through. This is always true. One recent example that's relevant this year with COVID is, why did Europe and Japan after World War II say, we want nationalized healthcare? We want healthcare for all. The government's going to pay for it. And the United States said, absolutely not. Why did that happen? Well, it's a really complicated topic. I don't want to pretend like there's one reason why that happened. But to me, one of the most compelling reasons is that Europe and Japan were destroyed physically during World War II. They were bombed to rubble. And at the end of the world, at the end of the war, you had the whole citizenry, coming together and saying, we desperately want safety and security because we're literally starving. We're living in rubble.
Right.
Whereas the United States paid a human element in the war, but there was no physical destruction in the homeland. So it was easier for us at the end of the war to say, no, we don't want safety and security. We want to swing for the fences for growth. And so just because people who've lived through a very different experience and have different life experiences can come to vastly different conclusions in terms of what is meaningful to them in life and what they want in life. And that's true for investors as well. I've joked before that the three most important investing skills are saving a lot, a long-term time horizon, and living during a period when interest rates fall from 10% to 0%. Those are the three investing skills. And you have people like famous bond managers who think they're geniuses. And I'm sure they're smart. This is back to the Bill Gates thing. They are smart. They are hardworking. But if you are an active bond manager during a period when the 10-year treasury rate went from 18% to half of 1% or 1%, whatever it is, of course, that's going to have a different impact versus if you were a bond manager, from 1950 to 1975.
You're either fighting uphill or you're rolling downhill like a snowball. Those are the two conditions you can be in any given market or medium or whatever.
People love really clean, easy to understand stories. Yeah. And the cleanest, easiest story is I was smart and I made the right decision.
By the way,
so many other factors playing into it.
It sounds like you read my one-page book on how to be a real estate multimillionaire.
What is it?
Well, the key is you want to be born into a family where the grandfather bought a few buildings in Manhattan in the 1940s. And then
That's it.
And then the end. And then you're rich forever. Your children are rich forever. They could be alcoholics, drug addicts. It almost doesn't matter. It's impossible to fall out of that level of wealth. You have to be deliberately trying to. And even in that case, you might not succeed. Your grandkids are rich forever. Their grandkids, because you're doing 1031 exchanges. Nobody's ever paying any taxes. The asset that you bought pretty much on every 10 years appreciates all the time. Things get a little tight, raise rents on people. Things get a little tighter, right. Buy yourself a few politicians. So that's this kind of path dependency. And then you meet the guy who's third generation scion of a Manhattan real estate empire and total putz. But it almost doesn't matter. Yeah. Look, he was fighting downhill his whole life if he fought at all. And everything fell into place.
This is the Chris Rock definition of rich versus wealth. He's You can't get rid of wealth. Once you have wealth, it's sticky. You cannot get rid of it. It's there for good.
There have been academic papers written about how there's almost a caste system at this point because the people that are in that top of that distribution, it's not just money they've already made. It's how much money their money makes that makes it impossible to fall out. What do you, when you finish writing a book like this, and I know how prolific you are as a writer, are you this would be stronger if I could fit in, these 5 other concepts? Or are you already saying to yourself, I'm ready for book 2 at some point because there's a lot I had to leave out?
It was hard. And this is something I'm sure you can relate with, that you can relate to as well. In a blog post, I do this on almost every post where after I publish it, there will be something 2 days later where I'm there's a sentence that I could have worded differently, or there's this example that I could have added in, and I'll just go in and change it. Right. Just go in a blog post, you can just edit whenever you want. But a book, at some point, you have to say,
try changing this.
It's done. And I'm never going to change it.
Yeah.
So that got really tough to turn in the manuscript to the publisher and say, this is done. And then after we edited it together to say, okay, this is the final version. And even after I got physical copies, I was flipping through and I just opened to a page and I read a paragraph and it was I could have said that differently. So it's always going to be frustrating. But at some point you just have to say it's done. For better or worse, this is what we got out. So that's been kind of, it's a hard thing to do that. I writing the book too was, look, I've been writing about this topic for 13 years. So the book is basically important points that I think I came across during that 13 years of study. Like what are the biggest, most important points and the best stories that I think I came across. But there's always, when you're writing it, like, should I go deeper? Is there more? Or as you're writing it, you come across something else, like, oh, should this be another chapter? And then you're also thinking like what's the ideal book length? Like I could add another chapter, but is that going to increase the number of people who don't finish it? Or is this just excess rambling? So it was tough to put that together. You know, when someone like myself and you are used to writing, let's call it 800-word blog posts, you get used to that rhythm, that pace, and that length. So to do something much longer than that is a totally different beast.
Well, I'm going to tell you a couple things. I think you're making a huge contribution to the body of behavioral finance books. And, you know, we all know the great ones that exist out there. Obviously, everything that Kahneman has done, et cetera. But like your book is more accessible in many ways than Thinking Fast and Slow. And I almost think like Thinking Fast and Slow should not be an early book that any investor tries to read, because I think it'll turn them off from these concepts. Like it's almost, look, it's I respect the obviously all of the academic work behind it, but we're talking about in a lot of cases presentation. And the presentation of that book I don't think is fitting for a 25-year-old who just wants to like have some basics about what's going on when they make personal finance decisions or purchase decisions or investment decisions. Your book in many ways should be like a precursor to anyone trying to tackle that. And I would tell like young people, I always give them this list of like 3 or 4 books that I found to be really helpful. And this would definitely be one of them. So I think
Thanks.
Yeah, of course. It's a huge accomplishment. I read it. I loved it. I breezed through it really fast. I may go back and reference parts of it here and there because it was so concise and so well done.
Here's one thing to say about that.
Please.
One thing I've always tried to do when like many years ago, I was a columnist at the Wall Street Journal, and they told me when I started, they said, your job is to write a column that is going to be valuable to a hedge fund manager, but understandable by some, random non-professional reading the book, reading this newspaper column in Iowa. It needs to be both of those things at the same time.
Wow.
It needs to be, and that was tough to do, but I always think about that lens. The lens that I think it through when I'm writing a blog post or the book is this valuable to a professional, but understandable to my mom? And my mom is an educated, very, very smart, curious woman, but she has no interest whatsoever in finance or economics. So if I can write something that is going to be relevant to you, Josh, but my mom would understand it at the same time, that's always a sweet spot that you're going for. And I think most topics you can do that. Even a complicated topic, you should be able to explain it in a way that doesn't lose any of the essence of what you're talking about, but can you still explain it using small enough words and short sentences and stories that are understandable to everyday people? Because they're not stories about finance, they're stories about how people think about risk and how people think about opportunity and scarcity, that kind of like funnels down to this financial concept that is typically presented through arcane formulas and big words just to try to make academic people feel good about themselves.
I think that's a really good point. We know you and I are friendly with a lot of practitioners in the industry, and a lot of them are like quantitative and they're extremely smart, way smarter than me. And they write well, but they write very technically. But I think they're doing that on purpose. It's directed to that audience that wants all the details and all the jargon, and they want to like kind of geek out on some of these concepts. That's not what you're doing here. What you're doing here is something that anyone can pick up and learn a lot about themselves, their relationship with money, things about the economy that maybe they didn't understand before reading, etc. So I think you really capture that spirit. If a hedge fund manager read this, they would get something out of it, and if somebody who's never invested $1 read it, they would get something out of it. So I think you accomplished that. You want people to buy this, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, physical bookstores. What's the best situation for you?
Look, it's 2020, so I don't think any of the bookstores are even open. So I think everything is Amazon these days, for better or worse.
All right, so everyone will check out The Psychology of Money on Amazon. We'll link to it in the show notes. My guest today has been Morgan Housel. You're on Twitter, @Morgan Housel?
That's it. Yep.
All right, good enough. So everyone will follow Morgan Housel on Twitter, pick up the book. Let us know what your thoughts are on these important financial concepts. We love your feedback. We'd love to hear from you. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Give us a like, and we will talk to you very soon.